Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the 6 steps to set, achieve and exceed your supply chain's emissions target. I'm Lucy. I work as Sustainability Content Manager at Supply Pilot, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. We'll be having a 45-minute panel discussion followed by a 15-minute Q&A session where you can ask our panelists all your burning questions about Scope 3 and supply chain emissions. So we'll be hearing from Sarah, David and Matt, who will be demonstrating the purpose and value of each step, which makes up an effective supply chain emissions initiative. Unfortunately, Kelly, who's one of our other panelists, is actually unable to make it today due to not being very well, so we wish her well. Also, throughout the panel session, I just want to mention that my behind-the-scenes colleague, April, will be popping some poll questions to you in the chat, which will correlate with what's being talked about at that time, just to make it all a little bit more interactive for everybody. So have a look out for those in the chat. But otherwise, grab your cup of coffee, your sandwich, and we'll get started with some introductions to our wonderful panelists for today. So yeah, Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself? Go first.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Lucy. Hi, everybody. Lovely to have you here today. I'm Sarah Blanchard. I'm representing Prof Consulting Group, which is a brand support growth agency. I'm the lead of ESG. My background is in food and sustainability in food service, wholesale and consulting.
Thanks, Sarah. Matt, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Lucy, and lovely to be here as well, speaking with you all today. I'm Matt. I'm one of the co-founders of My Emissions, and we're a specialist company that works with food and drink companies to measure their carbon footprint, help them to reduce their impact, and to then display results, whether through carbon labeling or other kind of metrics and infographics that can be produced. So really excited to be here today talking to you across the about all the supply chain problems and challenges and the fun of measuring Scope 3 emissions.
Great, thanks, Matt. David?
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm David Taylor. I've been at Supply Pilot for the past 10 years. My background's in change management and supplier engagement, and I'm here to share the perspective on supplier engagement and how you can better collaborate with suppliers to reduce your Scope 3 emissions.
Great, thanks, David. Now the introductions out of the way, we'll get on to some discussion. So just to kind of set the scene, I suppose, Sarah, would you be able to kind of help contextualize why Scope 3 emissions is so important for businesses and as part of a sustainability strategy?
Yes, of course. So I'll start with explaining some of the terms and then bring them together in context. So sustainability, as we know, it's about living and working in harmony with nature and only using resources we really need and leaving plenty for future generations. So for our children, their children, etc., in every part of the world. It's also about looking after each other, us, you, me, and living dignified lives. And Scope 3 is a term used in carbon accounting, which refers to greenhouse gases which are emitted by business activities. And Matt will talk in a bit more detail about this later. We refer to these greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide equivalents. I'll call them CO2 today. Natural and human activity produce CO2. It's released and absorbed within the Earth's natural carbon cycle, and CO2 traps energy from the sun, and this heats up the Earth. So the situation we now have is too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're almost at the limit of the Earth's capacity to absorb it. We have a nice visual here. April, could you pop in the NASA link into the chat, please? This heat builds up and creates severe weather like heat waves and storms with droughts, floods, and sea level rises, for example. And these weather events make up the climate. However, the sheer amount of CO2 has meant that events are happening more frequently and more severely and having really bad effects on nature and people. You might have heard of the term climate emergency. Since the mid-1800s, we've been burning fossil fuels, which have loaded CO2 into the atmosphere. And this has risen exponentially since 1950. And we're now at a 416 parts per million CO2 average. It's never been higher since ever in millennia than 300 parts per million. And by the way, I was born at 330 parts per million. I'm not going to tell you my age, but you can check out your ppm too. April will pop that link in the chat. So the climate emergency, it affects all of us, and it has its greatest negative impact on vulnerable and poor people in every part of the world. And it also impacts on our ability to source raw materials from nature. So that's the resources that our businesses need to make stuff. These emissions from business activities are a major contributor to climate change, and consumer goods account for 45% of global emissions. And at the same time, business is really affected by climate change. So for example, the recent heat wave damaged wheat crops in India, killed thousands of cattle in the United States. We saw a lot of the pictures of cattle that just kind of flopped over with the intense heat. For people who have to work outside, so on building sites or harvesting crops, for example, a severe heat wave can mean sickness or even death. There's also the economic cost of that. And then when we cut down forests, they emit CO2, especially if the area is burnt. Then we lose trees, which can absorb carbon dioxide or needed to absorb carbon dioxide. And what we tend to do, and I'm coming from more of a food perspective than here in packaging, is we tend to replant one species. So that's like a monocrop in those areas. And we dose it with fertilizers and pesticides, which also contribute emissions. And that ruins the natural variety of species in the area. You might hear about biodiversity, and it makes crops more vulnerable to disease and bad weather. So this kind of practice also tends to displace local and indigenous people, leaving them without a livelihood and creating political instability. So when we talk about sustainability and looking after resources for future generations, we can see that cutting carbon emissions from our businesses are an important route to achieve sustainability of people and planet. And it's really urgent that we cut carbon emissions. And we can't do this in isolation. We have to tackle all areas where our organizations have impacts on people and nature. And there's a little poll question that has popped up on there. We've got to drastically bring down emissions to net zero by 2050 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Some countries like the UK have set net zero targets. Some companies have done the same. But the positive aspect in all of this, it's not all doom and gloom, is that we in businesses can do something about it. And we actually have no choice if we want our organizations to survive in future, that there will be winners and losers. And there's wonderful opportunities for businesses to change how they produce things, cut emissions, and make a positive impact. And people from all walks are expecting us to do this. Our customers or shoppers want help to live more sustainably, like eating better or using detergents that don't pollute. Investors are ramping up the pressure because they don't want to put their money into risky enterprises. Employees, there's a lot of us here, want us to do better. And young people entering the workforce want to work for an organization that is doing good things for people and planet. There's also regulation and NGOs and citizen groups demanding action. It's all pushing us to change, but it's actually a great opportunity to innovate and connect with people who are involved in your operation and value chain to exchange ideas and make things better. So a lot of serious stuff there, a lot of really urgent action. Business is absolutely critical, and some great opportunities to make improvements and innovate. And we'll hear more about that later on.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, there's definitely a need for urgency, and I'm glad that you kind of highlighted that. Today, we're very much focusing on supply chain emissions within the context of Scope 3. Matt, could you talk to me about those and their importance, really?
Absolutely. So for a lot of businesses that are here, would normally expect Scope 3 to be the majority of your carbon footprint. So with some of the businesses that we work with, especially in the food and drink space, we can see 95, 96, if not in some cases more, of their emissions coming entirely from Scope 3. And what the difference there is in many ways, it's what you control, it's what you own. Is it emissions from buildings within your control? Is it transport, cars or vans or other vehicles that are in your control and owned? Or are the emissions coming from something that's from a third party, whether that's a co-manufacturer, from vehicles that are hired out, leased out, or contracted out to other companies, other providers. And so generally Scope 3 is going to be a majority of your carbon footprint, and it covers the entire value chain, really, the entire life cycle of your product. So it might incorporate the production of the materials, whether that's textiles, whether that's ingredients in foods, or other materials that are used to make and develop your products. It will incorporate the actual processing, the actual manufacturing, any packaging that's used, and any transport. Those are four key areas that we see as a major source of emissions throughout the supply chain, as well as potentially, depending on the type of business you are, if there's any refrigeration or cold storage that's required, that can also be included, as well as the actual emissions from any stores where the kind of your products are being sold. Although by that point we're going much further down the supply chain, and there's many challenges with trying to measure Scope 3 emissions. It's probably many of you are already thinking about how you might not know that much data, you might not have that much information on those areas of the supply chain. You might not, it might not be something that you don't really see. You might only see it from the point where the product is made and it's gone through 2 or 3 persons or companies' hands before it gets to you. And those are some challenges, but also what we're seeing, and I guess My Emissions is an example of that, is more and more kind of data-driven solutions and approaches to this problem, so that we can start at least measuring and estimating the carbon footprint all the way down supply chains, and to really get a handle and an idea of where your company's emissions are coming from. And that's then really crucial and valuable, because once you've got an idea of whether it is the farming or materials use, the packaging, the transport, or whatever it might be, where that impact's coming from, that then gives you that opportunity to really understand your carbon footprint, your impact on the environment, and how to reduce. But certainly it's an interesting challenge, and it's exciting because it's where there's also the biggest opportunities for reduction.
Yeah. And would you say, because you were talking about control a little bit there and influence, would you say it is more about control and influence when you're working with suppliers to first measure and reduce your supply chain emissions? Which one would you say it kind of goes towards, I guess?
I mean, certainly everyone here and all companies will have a level of influence over your supply chain, and whether that's choosing which suppliers you go to, where your products, materials, ingredients, or whatever else are coming from, how they're being transported, small changes and small decisions that are being made kind of at every point across the business can make a difference. And a lot of what we do with clients and what we work with is understanding where's the biggest chunk of emissions, where's the biggest source of emissions, and then looking there first, because that's usually the opportunity to reduce more. And whether, as you say, Lucy, it might be that, for example, it's processing emissions, energy emissions at your facilities, in which case that is something you might control and have a little bit more opportunity over. But if it's coming from, the materials that you're using in your products, whether that's a textile, whether it's a construction material, a raw material, or an ingredient, then the opportunity is the influence. And ultimately, you can always influence what products you're making, how they're coming to you, how they're being manufactured and developed. So there's always opportunities, and a lot of it is understanding where are those opportunities for reduce, where to look. And once you've got that guidance, usually a few kind of opportunities really do show themselves.
We did a piece of research over Christmas that looked at the different reasons why businesses adopt sustainability. So Scope 3, a key example, driving efficiency within the businesses. And what we noticed, there was a big difference between what makes a brand or a retailer at the top of the value chain adopt sustainable practices versus manufacturers. For manufacturers, the businesses that the people on today's webinar may have influence over, they're traditionally influenced by relational motivation. So if you think about downwards pressure from their customers, and they're also influenced by regulation, because typically they're smaller than the brands or the retailers. And what that for us highlighted is that there's a huge responsibility on those at the top of the value chain to influence and support those within the value chain. And I use those equally. It is about influencing and driving the change by setting that vision, but also it's about providing the support to those businesses as well, so that they've got the tools, the knowledge, the capabilities to be able to implement those changes as well.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to bring it back to Sarah, and just to talk about, for some of the people that have just joined, or I mean, it's only 15, 20 minutes in, what are kind of some low-hanging fruit and some quick wins that everybody likes a bit of some quick wins. What are some of those low-hanging fruit and quick wins that businesses could implement with suppliers to actually make improvements in this area, do you think, Sarah?
Okay, well, I'll try and give this a bit of a logistics flavour, as Kelly isn't here, and she's given us some great examples, and I'm going to link it with my experience with regards to products. So one of the things, you just start having the discussions with your suppliers. So work with your supplier to ensure, for example, space within your containers is fully utilised. I mean, it just sounds really obvious. You don't want to move air, as that's still producing a footprint when you're back hauling products. So never have an empty container or a truck. Try to work with that. Work with your logistics provider on initiatives at the origin that would include projects like consolidation, where you've got multiple suppliers' stock put into containers together rather than being shipped in part. At the final destination, consider the location of any new warehouse facilities in comparison to the final mile. And at that final mile, try to work with providers that have strong green credentials. So, for example, using electric powered vehicles. An example in Germany here is a local retail, a Dutch retail company whose deliveries are all done in these really tiny electric vans. And it's great because that cuts the carbon footprint, but it doesn't jam up the traffic as well. So that there is also that element as well. And you think that UPS has been electric, well, for as long as I can remember. One of the things that well, I'll come back to this, but it's not so long hanging fruit, but just something to think about. Work with hauliers to optimize the route, so truck routes that consider distance. That there's a lot of supply chain tools around using AI to be able to optimize that, and work with your providers that consider a mixed mode. So thinking that going by ocean is better than air, rail is better than road. For example, we've seen in Germany produce coming from the south of Spain being put on trains to the south of France, and then up again by train to Rungis market and for further distribution. So trains just aren't used enough. And I just heard something quite interesting around trucks, and that there's just, you need to have the infrastructure. What you need to do, so it's also not low-hanging fruit, but just something to think about, because we can't wait for these things to happen. There's got to be a bit of systemic thinking there. Talk to your infrastructure providers, whether that is your regional, local, national authorities, about having that infrastructure, those charging points. So we hear about, well, trucks can't go far enough electrically because there isn't enough infrastructure. Well, imagine that in Europe, drivers have to stop for a break every 4 hours. So, while they're charging themselves up, to recharge the batteries, it has another meaning, and maybe you're already doing this, but link your packaging design to logistics. I don't often see discussions between logistics people and the packaging team. So design your products, particularly those coming from very long distances, with transport in mind, and think of the space that's in a container and design the packaging back from there, and design it so it doesn't carry around excess air. Design it so it's ready to go on shelf directly from the pallet, because it will take less packaging and it'll also be quicker to load on shelf. So it's a bit more efficient. And, really just talk with your suppliers. Next time you're due a call, ask what they're doing about their carbon emissions. You might be pleasantly surprised. And if not, it's a chance to kick off the discussion, and don't worry about not knowing everything about emissions and scope 3s and whatnot. Most people are still trying to figure this out. The main thing is just to get going, get those conversations going. How about you, Matt? Have you got some
I was just going to
advice?
jump on the back there, because I think that last point, especially for me, is something we really do encourage all of our clients to do. Even today I was talking to a client who they're lucky enough that they have a co-manufacturer who produces their products for an entire week and only their products in that week. So we can get some really, really good quality data. Because we encourage them to start speaking with their manufacturers and seeing if they could measure, take meter readings at the start of the week and end of the week. And they've started doing it, and we're now getting a regular supply every month of the latest, like their week's energy, gas, electricity usage throughout the site. And that's some really, really great primary data on processing from the manufacturer. And actually it's got them thinking about emissions. And once you've got numbers in place, it's really easy to kind of gamify it. Myself and Nathan, my co-founder, we started My Mission because we wanted to see data and numbers. And when someone sees that something is, 1,010 or whatever it is, naturally your first thought is, can you get it into 900 and something? Can you get it down a little bit? And they're starting to think about, okay, well, what if we have a bigger mix? If we add more of the product into, there's a mixing stage in the process, can you get more products into there so you do it in one go rather than maybe doing 2 or 3 stages, and try and optimize their kind of process within the manufacturing stage? And that will have the knock-on effects of reducing our clients' Scope 3 emissions. And all of that's just come from them asking the question of, well, can you measure your carbon footprint? Can you take a meter reading at the start and the end, and let's see what it looks like? So there's really power. And I think it goes back also to what you were saying at the start to me, Lucy, about whether it's about control or influence. And just asking these questions can have really surprising, like, knock-on impacts all the way down that supply chain.
One of the first activities that we do with any client interested in Scope 3 is what we call a supplier readiness survey, which is a way of formalising those initial questions. A lot of people feel like they're between a rock and a hard place with Scope 3 and supply chain emissions. They've got their leaders within their business standing up, making very ambitious, as they should be, commitments to reducing emissions. And on the same hands, they can literally play through conversations they could be having with suppliers where they're asking for this detailed emissions data, and some of the suppliers would be there scratching their head. So within the world of employee engagement and learning and development, there's something called a learning needs analysis, which most large businesses do now when they're thinking about driving change within their own organization. But very few organizations apply the same concept to the people within their suppliers. And people are people. Ultimately, they need to understand what gaps they have in their knowledge. So I'd encourage any business, before they start collecting that emissions data, is send the suppliers out a questionnaire, understand, do they have a policy? Do they currently have any performance measures within their organization? Are they doing any carbon literacy training? If we asked for the emissions data, what level of data would you be able to provide? And just as people have in the past with disciplines like supplier relationship management, SRM, you can then segment your supply base based on their knowledge, their maturity, and their capabilities around Scope 3. And then that can help your procurement, your buying, your sustainability, your engineering, whichever teams, they can be more intelligent and intentional about their outreach to suppliers. Ask the right data from suppliers who can provide it, but are equally providing support to those who can't. There's so many free webinars like this one out there. Simply just sharing resources like this, or from the Carbon Trust or the CDP, with your suppliers is a really light touch activity you could start doing tomorrow, but could potentially have a huge impact in growing the carbon literacy within your supply chain.
Could I extend on that and just tease out something which Matthew, you touched on? One of the advantages of doing this, or this whole climate emergency situation, is that it's really getting people to set targets for a topic that is sustainability focused. And in some cases, this is becoming a legal requirement, if not, then an industry requirement. So it's really pushing people to do something. And when you start working out what your Scope 3s are and where your suppliers are, what your supply chain looks like, you start opening that up. It becomes much more transparent, and then you start to see, what inefficiencies are there. How many steps are you having to go through to actually get to the product that is being produced? Are those steps in there for good reasons? Sometimes there are, sometimes they're not. But it also starts you to be able to start pulling out information about your product and your suppliers, which brings out more information like where is it being produced, under what conditions. So it's not only the carbon emissions, but it is the origin, the conditions, the people, and it's that kind of transparency that people are so much more looking for now. So it's not just something on carbon emissions, there is the urgency on that, thankfully, but it opens up these other opportunities as well.
Yeah, definitely. Some great answers there. Probably just building on what everybody's just spoken about, and what you've just said, Sarah. What kind of approach do businesses need to prioritize when they're tackling Scope 3? Like, how do people decide what's important and where to focus? I think this probably builds on one of the questions that's just come in through the chat as well. Like, what is the focus and prioritization, and what should that be so early on in a Scope 3 initiative?
Okay, so but we've covered talking to your suppliers, get talking internally.
I'm just saying you might have partly answered some of it, but
absolutely. Talking with procurement, because people in procurement know very well where they're getting products from, sourcing and logistics teams. And if you are in procurement, sourcing and logistics, then talk with sustainability and quality, because you will all have sources of data that you can share about your supply chain activities. Then start to make an inventory of your Scope 3 emissions. So purchase products, logistics are usually the biggest. You can use something like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So that's the well-known standard, and it's freely available. And once you have this inventory, set a target and get it approved. So I'm saying this all very quickly: inventory, target, get it approved. It does take time, but there are recognized methodologies that you can use for this now. And in terms of getting a science-based target approved, there is the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's the most well-known. And they actually have several sets of guidance for different sectors. And just recently, they've put out guidance for agriculture and land-based activities, which wasn't there before. It's also very new. So that really helps you. You can also check out your own sector for advice. So in the UK, for example, there is the Food and Drink Federation, or the IGD. For food and drink, there is WRAP in the UK. They've just released a Scope 3 protocol, which is really useful and has questionnaires for suppliers already set up in there that you can get going with that. And that's being tested on a pilot at the moment. I would say make sure once you've got your inventory, make sure you set a baseline against which to measure your future emissions, because you want to have that comparability, which Matt referred to earlier. And use whatever data you have. Start with spend, what you're buying at the start, so in currency value, and move to quantity-based data when you can. Not everybody has available, but you need to move to that at the next stage. And go through your procurement practices and see where you can integrate carbon reduction practices. So, for example, have you got product specifications, and do they list the amount of packaging in there, for example? Because if they do, then you're going to be able to link that to your spend and be able to work out how much packaging you're sourcing, because that also has an emissions value to it as well. Check what sourcing policies you already have and what you still need. So, for example, a no deforestation policy for sourcing raw materials like palm oil or soy. But to do that, to have those policies there, you need to understand what's relevant to your business. And that means doing a materiality assessment. So seeing what's important to your business, so fiber for making packaging, for example, what risks there are in producing it, and start cutting your emissions. You go through all this, then start cutting your emissions, you've got your target, and then you start to build more data. You'll identify those hotspots. Matt, you will talk about this, I think, in a bit, but agriculture is generally the heaviest part of your emissions. And if we come back to WRAP, that is food and drink focused, but they really have some questionnaires that you can use for agriculture supplied products. So there is stuff there, use it, give yourself enough time, because there is a lot, but there is so much guidance out there now available.
Okay, great. I mean, just building on your point, Sarah, about having that kind of baseline and benchmarked and be able to get that data to start reducing emissions within your supply chain. I'm just going to ask David, what are the kind of challenges and difficulties that businesses face at these stages of a Scope 3 emissions initiative when they're engaging suppliers?
Absolutely. And there really is a tension between the internal challenges that I'm sure every business is facing for all of their initiatives. So you've got things like increasingly ambitious deadlines, which within the context of Scope 3 is your leaders standing up, making those net zero commitments. Equally, we've got a lack of resource. I'm sure many people on this call have colleagues or different functions who have got supply chain challenges off the back of the global pandemic that are continuing to affect businesses. Certainly what we're hearing from a lot of our clients is that supply chain continuity is becoming a priority, and ultimately that's consuming a lot of the resources and focus that off the back of COP26, we were starting to see a lot of traction, and almost there's that delicate friction between businesses needing to be competitive and deliver on long-standing expectations of customers versus actually delivering on the other two pillars of triple bottom line, the people and the planet, not just the profit piece as well. From a supplier context, again, it depends by which industry, but what I find for most CPG industries is that they've got a combination of hundreds of suppliers, thousands of products or SKUs spread across dozens of different categories. And therefore, the expertise within the organization has to be very generalist. That's not to do anyone working within these brands a disservice. Ultimately, you have to comprehend a huge breadth of different sustainability issues to cope with the organization's breadth of product portfolio. But the result of that is the only way to address the nuances of sustainability is by collaborating with the suppliers within the supply chain so they can come up with the 1,000 different unique solutions to 1,000 different unique sustainability challenges that you have. You then got very practical challenges like you'll have language barriers, you'll have the supply capacity challenges on their own end, again, upholding that supply chain continuity. And in some cases, you may have some confidentiality concerns, but what we typically find is that that's a barrier to suppliers not wanting to admit that they may not know the information that you're assuming through your communication method that they provide. A lot of these challenges can be addressed by communicating more clearly. Again, to draw a similar parallel to what I did earlier, in the 90s and noughties, we saw a huge revolution with the way businesses thought about working with and engaging their employees because they recognized people are people. And if you let them know what's expected of them, let them know how they're performing in those expectations and help them get better to fill the gaps, ultimately employees will do better. We fundamentally believe that the same principle applies to your suppliers. The problem is because of the complexity and scale of the modern supply chain, you need different tools in place to be able to facilitate those. But again, starting at first principles, set clear expectations, let people know how they're performing against those expectations, and then mutually support each other to get better to close those performance gaps.
Great, thank you. As Sarah, Matt, anything you'd like to add there? Or
I guess one thought that I just had is also collaboration. So there's a lot of businesses with different specialties. We've got 3 on this call with ourselves at My Mission, Supply Pilot and Prof. And often as when working with much bigger clients where there is a lot more complexity, there's usually opportunities to collaborate and work with a number of partner companies, which can allow bringing together different specialties. So, in our case, our expertise is in the actual data itself and putting the data there. Someone like Supply Pilot has a much more expertise on actually measuring and tracking and monitoring supply chains. And then Prof has a whole range of expertise, both in terms of actual reduction analysis, how to make improvements, engaging with different suppliers and being more hands-on across. And so there's huge opportunities to work with more than just one individual, one company, and actually an opportunity to bring together different specialties to really get the best for your businesses.
Yeah. So if we build on kind of your speciality then, Matt, how should businesses be commercializing the hard work that they put into supply chain emissions initiatives? So they've kind of prepped their and readied their suppliers, got a baseline and benchmark, and have collected data. What then? What should businesses be doing?
Well, the first I guess how you can use it really depends on the results. And we've seen the companies we've worked with kind of use this and commercialize it in multiple different ways. The first obvious way is and it builds on that importance of taking a baseline. If you can then reduce your carbon footprint and then be able to show that in an updated calculation and be able to reduce your overall carbon footprint, whether on an absolute or an intensity basis. Intensity takes into account, say, if the amount of products that you've sold in the last year, let's say, has increased 50%, might not be realistic for you to have overall reduced your carbon footprint, but you might have been able to reduce your carbon footprint per product sold or per pound spent or whatever that intensity metric might be. But that's a really then powerful metric and statement to be able to say, whether that's to consumers, to investors, to retailers, or to anyone else, any kind of other stakeholder that you're working with. There's then being able to communicate the individual carbon footprint or environmental impacts of specific products or items, being able to, you might be able to use, I guess from a starting point right now, carbon labeling, environmental labeling is still very, very new. And in many ways, just having that in itself is still right now, it's still newsworthy. It's still eye-grabbing, and it's still very much ahead of the curve. And so in itself, having it is something to shout about and to communicate and really establish that kind of transparency and trust with your customers. But then there's also that opportunity to highlight the lower carbon, environmentally friendly products, and maybe potentially using that as a way of kind of promoting them, raising their profile and awareness, trying to boost and increase those scales. And that might actually be an effective way of even reducing your carbon footprint, which then creates a nice loop of it being one of the effective ways of reducing your carbon footprint, to give you that metric to say that you've reduced your carbon footprint, and it just giving a constant kind of supply of content that you can use. So there's a whole kind of opportunity, we would say, and especially where now that consumers and customers are becoming so climate conscious and aware, and being able to build that trust and that transparency and being kind of on their side and really wanting to kind of be working with them in this journey, we see so much opportunity and potential there, and we're seeing it already from our clients in terms of boosting their awareness and really being effective for them.
Yeah. Just wanted to bring it back to I suppose the title of this webinar is very much the 6 steps of how to set, achieve and exceed your targets around supply chain emissions. David, how would you kind of summarize this approach? I know we've kind of touched on a few different steps already, but would you like to kind of, I suppose, make it a little bit more explicit what we mean around these 6 steps?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've covered all the points throughout our conversation over the last 40 minutes. But when we talk about 6 steps, we're talking about the Supply Pilot 6-step process, which is step number 1, identify the materially important issues, which within the context of this session is the carbon emissions, the Scope 3 supply chain emissions. And that step's all about helping suppliers and your stakeholders to understand the importance of that and what you're trying to achieve. Step 2 is about establishing SMART goals, which Sarah shared some different avenues like the Science-Based Target Initiative that you can use to benchmark and substantiate your claims. And that's where we at Supply Pilot recommend you conduct that supplier readiness assessment to understand the knowledge and capabilities of your suppliers so that SMART goal is realistic and achievable. Step number 3 is all about benchmarking, which Matt shared a lot about, around understanding the data within your products, within your supply chain, so you can move towards some of those exciting claims that really kind of bring your sustainability strategy to life within your eyes of your customers, whether that's through growing brand loyalty or product claims or the internal operational efficiencies. Step 4 is about activating suppliers, which is the change management piece. As I said, what do you expect of suppliers? How are they doing against those expectations? How do they get better? It's like the very tactical stuff is like your supplier portal, sharing knowledge, doing webinars, targeting emails based on where suppliers are in their journey. Step 5 is all about data-driven KPI, whether that's externally facing with your groups like the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative, or through your CDP carbon disclosure, or whether it's with your suppliers around supplier scorecards and bringing together those ESG and sustainability metrics like their Scope 3 emissions with the commercial metrics, the more traditional ones like on-time delivery and sales. And then the final step is the one that's really excited, and almost many brands want to jump to this before they've actually done the hard work of the first 5 steps. That's through commercializing it through things like product claims, working with people like My Emissions, or through brand marketing, which we see a lot of on TV, but like I say, don't necessarily go through the first 5 steps to be able to substantiate and back those claims up, which can be a real risk for brands.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you kind of made that point, David, about like it being, we're seeing lots of it, but are we seeing the data and the work, the engagement of suppliers behind the scenes as well? So which brings me to a question that I was going to ask Matt, actually. Is there anything that business should be wary of doing at this stage, like in terms of the commercialization side of an initiative?
There is, and I'm sure many people have seen in the news more recently, where a few much larger companies, for example, Tesco, Innocent, and Oatly, have all been caught up by this new regulation that's been introduced, the Green Claims Codes. And what this really is a response to is trying to reduce the chances of greenwashing and to make sure that any environmental claims that a company is making is backed up by evidence and is substantiated. And the most recent example of this was Tesco in their plant-based meat burgers compared to maybe a standard beef burger. And the reason that their advertising campaign was challenged and was told it breached the code was not necessarily that it was it didn't include enough information on the advert, or that it was misleading. That the issue with it is that when Tesco were approached and asked whether or not there was any evidence behind their claims, so their claim was that there was a significant environmental benefit of their specific plant-based meat range as opposed to an equivalent beef or meat range. When they were approached and asked, have they done a life cycle assessment? Have they done any studies to verify that specific claim was correct? And their answer was no, and that they hadn't done that assessment and that analysis, and therefore they breached the code, and there's the risk of being fined, and generally those claims being and those campaigns being taken down. And what that really is a message for is, what that's really saying to us is that now there's an expectation that any environmental claims are substantiated. Crucially, they need to be taking into account a substantial, or if not the entire life cycle of a product. So you can't say, for example, we've got sustainable packaging and therefore our product is sustainable, because packaging is just one part of the product's life cycle. And so it's saying that there needs to be some data and some evidence behind any claims that you make. It's not necessarily, and it's in any way insurmountable. It's not something that we think should be too scary for clients and for companies wanting to make environmental claims. I hope it doesn't turn people away from doing it. But certainly there is now an expectation that there's the right kind of research and studies are done before environmental claims are made, to make sure that they are pointing to the right things.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to, I know we're kind of moving on to the Q&A quite soon. Just wanted to ask all three of you, Sarah, Matt, David. We recently did a survey with businesses, and we found that 78 businesses say that almost all of their suppliers cannot provide emissions data. Now, this was across lots of different industries. I know we've kind of focused a little bit on food and drink, like in our chats today, but this was across all different businesses. What are your kind of thoughts on that? Because that's not just one industry, that's across a whole load of industries. Do you think it's because of readiness? Do you think it's because of the lack of knowledge, lack of engagement? What do you think has caused this, I suppose, that lots of businesses don't think that their suppliers are able to actually provide any data for them?
Okay, I can maybe start with that, and hope, Matt, that you can enrich this. So I think sometimes it is this lack of being asked and prioritizing it. There is also not knowing the terms and relating it to climate change and business risk. But, you know, I'm sure everyone can provide that information, because most businesses have an electricity bill, right? So that can be converted to CO2 emissions. Matt, you'll know the exact right term here. And I think most people are looking quite seriously at their bills right now. And if your suppliers, or if you're not doing it, you have to wonder why not, because that is on everybody's mind right now. But I would also say that there are probably a lot's going on to limit emissions without actually recording them. So, for example, sourcing less emissions intensive raw materials, like certified fresh produce that has limited pesticides under some kind of environmental certification scheme, or purchasing policies that exclude products derived from deforested land, like soy for animal feed, or different packaging initiatives or alternatives. So a lot of the stuff is going on, but it's just not being recorded in this way. Perhaps I can give a recent example. A client wanted to have some help. They had an investor asking them what were they doing about emissions and ESG, and they said, we're doing nothing. And they said, well, what actually is your business? And they were a composting company. Now they're picking up clippings from garden and food waste and composting it, and then giving it to farmers to put on their land. Yet they're doing nothing about emissions. They just didn't have the language to talk about it, and that's a really missed opportunity, because they had an investor asking them what they were doing. So Matt, I'm sure you have some examples on here.
No, I think it goes to what you were saying at the start, that I don't think it's still relatively new, and I think a lot of it comes down to manufacturers not being asked sufficiently and enough times, and kind of it touches on David. I thought it was really interesting, those statistics you said earlier on the survey that you did to manufacturers of what are the drivers, what is it that makes them like change their behavior, and to start measuring this content. And I think if more and more people and more of their clients are asking them for this data, well, they're going to start getting it together, because then it can be used across the board. And we're certainly seeing with all of our clients a big increase in the amount that are saying, okay, we've already measured it now, and we just have the data here that we can give to you. Or we've seen we've actually ended up working directly with the suppliers or manufacturers, and they've actually been quite excited and engaged by the topic, because, as I mentioned, there's that gamification opportunity. So I think at the moment, so much of it was, it is complicated, it is difficult. You can get so far with just asking a question and just starting and actually seeing where it is, because you might end up being surprised. A very small example is maybe your products are manufactured in 5 facilities, of which 4 haven't measured, but 1 has. Well, if you've got that data, you can straight away start there, and you can use that as a baseline for all of the others. And then that reframes the way that you approach this. Suddenly you're not looking to try and measure your emissions across all of your supply chain. Maybe just start with one manufacturer at the moment, one supply route for the start there, build it up. That might then also give you a framework and give you some insights and some guidance on how to work with the other 4 to help start measuring it and improving it and reducing it. So it's almost exactly the same as what we say to clients generally about scope 3, is that you can't make improvements until you've measured and you understand what your impact is. So in the same way, you can't really start thinking about how to engage with suppliers until you've just engaged with them and asked them what do they know, where are they on their journey, and suddenly you will you'll start removing those assumptions, removing those guesses, putting data in, and really getting an idea of where you stand. And from there, the possibilities are endless.
Whilst we don't normally use this word within a professional setting, there's a lot of anxiety associated with the emerging role of a sustainability or an ESG professional. Whilst I know the conversation today is focused a lot on food by virtue of our backgrounds, but if you think about industries like electrical manufacturing or concrete or mining or oil, a lot of the people moving into sustainability or CSR roles actually come from quality or engineering backgrounds, and they're very black and white, process oriented, binary industries. And actually moving into the world of sustainability and ESG, there's so much nuance. There's no rules. Literally, people are inventing it as they go along, which we need to. But ultimately, there's a lot of anxiety within our supply chain associated with being forced to give data, which we, A, may not be able to do, and B, even if we do it, we may feel it's not good enough or not correct. So again, this goes towards making sure that the dialogue you're having with the people within the supply chain comes from that place of empathy. And by not simply asking, can you provide the data, yes or no, which may people think it's potentially, I mean, you've got to remember as well, you're your supplier's customers and they ultimately want to do a good job for you. They want to please you. They want to give you the right answers. Simple changes like when you're engaging with suppliers, moving from a binary yes/no questions to a scale. Now, whilst it isn't scope 3, it's a good example. A few years ago, there was a piece of legislation in America around genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and very few manufacturers within the country had measured GMOs. And lots of retailers were saying, do you have GMOs within your product? Yes or no? And very few people actually knew. Whereas the approach we advocate was if you went to a 5-point scale of do you have GMOs within your product, or within this context, can you provide up-to-date and accurate scope 3 information? Yes, I think so. I'm not sure. I don't know, or I can't. Suddenly you've got a much richer view of the competencies and capabilities within your supply chain. I love Matt's example of 5 facilities. You've got 1 who can, 4 who can't. You can ultimately break that problem down then and go, how can I get that one manufacturer to appropriately support the others? How can I build their capabilities, make them a category champion? And again, typically, whilst that's a nice, easy challenge to think about because it's only 5 suppliers, normally the businesses we're dealing with, you've got 500 or 5,000 suppliers. But thinking in those terms, I think is a really useful because it helps to simplify the problem, which can feel really overwhelming. And that overwhelm can stop us from taking small but meaningful actions that add up over the course of a project.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is going to be always about the finding a way to make it simplified and accessible to suppliers and internally as well. Like sustainability can feel like it's a very exclusive place at times as well. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to kind of move on to a little bit of a Q&A session. I know we've kind of already got a couple of questions come through on the chat. I think we had one earlier, which was to Sarah, which was what focus and prioritization is the freight management and forwarding sector placing on conversion to electric, and what are government doing in this space regarding infrastructure?
Well, I would love to say I'm going to phone a friend. She's laid up in bed right now. So I'm so sorry. I cannot give a qualified answer to that. I'm looking around at my panelists to see if they can, but I'm sure that we can ask Kelly and perhaps send something
Kelly's
around afterwards. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, maybe look at something like the International Energy Agency or Google Energy Infrastructure or EV infrastructure in whichever country, and then see what's going on there. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a straight answer.
I think that was one for Kelly, but unfortunately she's not here today. So I just wanted to invite everybody that's attending to pop some questions in the chat. Whatever your burning questions about scope 3, your current challenges are, pop them in the chat. In the meantime, I've actually got a question as well, which is just to all the panelists. Where on what industries or particular companies, but probably most industries because I know that we've got quite a few different industries attending today. Where do you see most progress happening around scope 3 emissions? What kind of areas of industry? To anybody who wants to take this one?
Oh, I can have a stab at it. And I would say, honestly, as we want this to be fact-based and science-based, go onto the science-based initiative, look at companies in the sector that you're interested in, and look at those ones that have set targets for 2025, 2030, 2040, and have had them approved by the SBTi or are shortly going to have them. And I would say look at those companies as well that are targeting absolute emissions reductions as opposed to intensity. Matt, you touched on it earlier. And I say this because we can't just keep on making more and more and more and more stuff, but just less intensive. That there's got to be this element of looking at that full impact of the product throughout scope 3. So not just supply chain, but how it's used. And Matt, you referred to this as well. And I would say, really think about and look at those businesses who have got those models that are really looking at what value it adds and the purpose of it. And it can be a very different business model. So for me, I'm really interested in companies who aren't just selling more stuff, because that is just more emissions. So companies that are supporting sharing schemes, like for equipment, there's a few of these libraries around where you have household tools like lawnmowers, for example. And that has some implication on people who make tools. Reuse or return schemes for packaging for out of home. One of the big food service, quick service restaurants did that recently. Food waste schemes, so people who are using wasted food to go back into the system. There's a really good initiative, it's actually going on in Zimbabwe, where a very big global coffee maker is giving their coffee grounds that would otherwise just go into a landfill to local people, in particular local women, who then make mushrooms out of them, and then they sell them on the local market. So this is like a really nice connection between emissions, food waste, because food waste is an emission, and supporting people, and that's an input, a low emissions input into their own production. So this links people and planet. So really great practices there. And then that there's I think it's well, I'm not going to say the big name because it's supporting, I don't want to sound biased, but there is a pet food that's been made from insects that have been grown on food waste. It's viable, it's on the market, it's a big brand. This is a great example. It's thinking differently there. So just some examples, quite a few of those out there. Hand it over to the rest of the panel to see what you have.
Anything from you, Matt or David?
I'm very biased as I work within the food and drink sector. So it would be very easy for me to say, oh yes, well, we're seeing loads of activity in the food sector, but we are, and it's really exciting to see more of the major contract caterers and retailers now, especially in the UK, starting to explore environmental labelling and other forms of kind of sustainability initiatives, and we're seeing a lot more grants, we're seeing a lot more schemes to try and promote low carbon, environmentally friendly products. So they're looking to their suppliers to try and reduce that, and maybe that's actually, again, really good case studies of a lot of what we've talked about, that especially within the retailer space, where their scope 3 emissions are from the products that they stock. They've been going to and talking to their suppliers to understand what they're doing. So I know as a kind of the way we like to, or at least hope that scope 3 will go, is that one day scope 3 won't be about trying to measure and estimate down the supply chain. It will be a simple data sharing exercise where everyone's measured their carbon footprint, and it's just about, well, what's your carbon footprint plus transport? And that would be a really nice opportunity to get to.
The ideal world, yeah.
No, one day. But yeah, it's hard for me to say where are we seeing the most activity, just because for us and my bubble is certainly within the food and drink space. So yeah, that's probably as much of the examples and context I can give, sadly.
No, that's entirely fair. I think we've kind of wrapped up the questions from the chat. I know that it's 2:00 now, conscious of time. So just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. Let us know if you have any questions. There'll be a link in the chat to subscribe to our mailing list. So go ahead and do that now once April's popped it in. And we'll also be sharing the details of panelists alongside a short survey tomorrow via email. So you'll get that straight to your inbox. We'd be really grateful if you can complete it. It takes about 5 minutes, as it will help us to develop even more great webinars for you in the future, really. So yeah, once again, thank you for attending. Make sure to subscribe. Have a great week, and we'll see everybody soon, hopefully. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.